Good morning, friends. Today is Thursday, June 25th. I'm a day late on the Wednesday reflection and doing it on a Thursday. However, doing reflection really on yesterday's feast, a great feast, the birth of St. John the Baptist. Too good to pass up. It's 6 months and a day till Christmas that we celebrate John the Baptist, his being the forerunner of Jesus Christ by just a few months in his birth. So let's listen to the gospel reading from that feast, from yesterday's feast of St. John the Baptist. When the time arrived for Elizabeth to have her child, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown his great mercy toward her, and they rejoiced with her. When they came on the 8th day to circumcise the child, they were going to call him Zechariah after his father, but his mother said in reply, "No, he will be called John." But they answered her, "There's no one among your relatives who has this name." So they made signs asking his father what he wished him to be called. He asked for a tablet and wrote, "John is his name." And all were amazed. Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue freed, and he spoke, blessing God. Then fear came upon all their neighbors, and all these matters were discussed throughout the hill country of Judea. All who heard these things took them to heart, saying, "What then will this child be? For surely the hand of the Lord was with him." The child grew and became strong in spirit, and he was in the desert until the day of his manifestation to Israel. It was in assigning names and choosing names for the after the birth of a child, certainly for those of you who are parents, I'm sure, a real wonderful memory. It was my dad's assignment, my dad, who's actually today would have been his 99th birthday, were he still alive, my dad's assignment to pick my brothers and my middle names. And so he went traditional with Joseph, Anthony, and John. And my mother, on the hand, was more daring in selecting our first names, daring for our conservative Catholic family, Dennis, Dean, and Dale. My grandma thought the names were pretty odd. And so it was for John the Baptist. People were surprised. They expected him to be Zechariah Jr., of course. And so when they came up with John, people thought, where did she come up with that? But the name, of course, didn't come from nowhere. Like other things that seem to come from nowhere, it came from an angel, and thereby naming John, giving him his identity, giving him his mission. John means God has shown favor. John would be that doorway between the old and the new. It was the beginning of a new era. And in the gospel we see that being expressed by Zechariah getting his voice back, getting a new voice that could praise God as he began to do. So the role of John the Baptist is pointing the way to Christ, always modest and realistic about his own message. You know, John had quite a community of his own, of course. He was a Baptist, and so that's what he did. He moved people to be plunged into the river, to start living a new life. But not a life that John designed, but a life that someone else would guide and lead and direct. And that, of course, was Jesus. So John always pointing the way to someone, stepping out of the way as a prophet, pointing the way to Jesus Christ, getting out of his own way. As I was reflecting on this yesterday, and really as I've been reflecting on this for a number of weeks now, this prophetic role that all of us have by virtue of our baptism. So in these times, when people are looking for wisdom and insight and guidance in moving us through this period of kind of this new time of racial call for racial justice and racial equity. You know, what is the prophetic word? I mean, who are we pointing to? Always Jesus, of course. I talked about that a bit in my homily on Sunday, that as a Christian community, you know, we can offer lots of insights about racial equity and being anti-racist. And, you know, we hear people sharing insights about that all the time these days. But what we as Christians remember, or have to keep turning to, is that our word always comes out of faith, our faith in Jesus Christ. So that the basis for equality is, of course, that all are created in the likeness of God. All have the same dignity. That's the fundamental basis of our insight, and as Christians, the fact that we are willing to give up our lives, lay down our lives for our friends, for those others with whom we share the likeness of God. So like John the Baptist, always pointing to Jesus Christ, always pointing to what our Christian faith is teaching us in this time, or calling us to, or moving us to. I was reading some of Walter Burkhart. Walter Burkhart was a Jesuit who was known for his not only preaching justice, but helping preachers to preach justice. A real teacher in that regard. He died probably about 10 years ago now. But in a talk he gave on preaching and preaching the prophetic word, preaching biblical justice, Burkhart identifies and describes 5 marks of the Hebrew prophets. 1, they're extraordinarily sensitive to evil and to injustice, always crying out against injustice, especially against poor, and justice toward the poor. 2, they feel fiercely. He says, in their voice, God rages. They are compelled to speak this very powerful word of God because they feel it in their belly. They're iconoclasts who challenge sacred institutions, sacred beliefs, and sacred persons. They're not unwilling to take on institutions that have been around for a long time, institutions that people's sacred cows, if you will. For they're often embarrassed, lonely, and frustrated. John is saying himself, he's a voice crying in the desert, a lonely voice. No one else seems to be saying what he needs to say. And 5, their words are charged with divine power because they've experienced the God of the covenant, a God involved in history and a God intimately affected by events. They have experienced God themselves. They've not only heard that this is what God said, but they themselves have had a profound experience of that God acting, alive and acting in their lives. And so what inspiration does this give to the preacher? So Burkhart draws these parallels between the Hebrew prophets and the preacher of today, who is called to preach biblical justice. So Burkhart says that Christian preachers, number 1, must be sensitive to evil and injustice, must feel fiercely so that they preach with passion, must ceaselessly challenge the community. 4, will often be lonely and frustrated by their congregations, for their preaching is a prayer that stems from their hurts, their joys, their hopes, an inspired word that helps their congregation see Jesus with their own eyes, hear them with their own hearts, respond to him with fresh fervor. And 5, will experience words charged with divine power, not primarily because they have been ordained to preach, but because they have experienced God. So that the preacher, the modern day prophet, shares these experiences, these qualities with the Hebrew prophets. And what for me is most critical, and I think Burkhart would write about this in other places, is of course that the primary requisite is that the preacher, the prophet, feels this in his or her belly. That is to say, and this is another wonderful thing he says, that the response to a sermon or to a homily or to preaching isn't, oh, now I believe this, because this is what I heard this preacher say. But the response always to a good homily or a good sermon is, so what do I do now, Lord? What do you want me to do, Lord, in the words of St. Paul? Evoking a response. The preacher himself, herself, has to be converted. If conversion is what the prophet is seeking, John the Baptist, another perfect example, if conversion is what the prophet is seeking, then he or she himself has to be converted, has experienced this conversion themselves and has this fire in the gut, this fire in the belly. So that's great. I mean, that, you might say, that's great. You're a preacher, you're a priest, that's important stuff for you to pay attention to. However, It's important stuff for you to pay attention to these days, because all of us are baptized to be prophets, to share in the prophetic role of Jesus Christ. We are when we're signed with the chrism oil. The words are, just as Jesus was anointed priest, prophet, and king, so may you be, so may you live. So as a priest, all of us share and take responsibility for the worship of God. As a king, pardon the male image, all of us share in guiding and leading the people of God. And as a prophet, all of us share in proclaiming the word, This is expressed beautifully in the Second Vatican Council in the document Lumen Gentium, the Constitution on the Church. And it says this. I dug it up yesterday. Just as the sacraments of the new law, by which the life and the apostolate of the faithful are nourished, prefigure a new heaven and a new earth, so too the laity go forth as powerful proclaimers of a faith in things to be hoped for, when they courageously join to their profession of faith a life springing from faith. Beautiful words, that we are proclaimers of the word. When we attach to our statements of faith, our statement of belief, a life springing from faith. So a life that has been inspired by our relationship with Jesus Christ. Goes on to say, this evangelization, that is, this announcing of Christ by a living testimony, as well as by the spoken word, takes on a specific quality and a special force in that it is carried out in the ordinary surroundings of the world. That, if I as a pastor, am working at the Church of the Ascension on behalf of Archbishop Hebda, that is, I share in his pastoral responsibility here on the corner of 18th and Bryant. So too, everyone who is a member of Ascension lives their pastoral responsibility, their prophetic responsibility, their Christian responsibility in all the many places that we come from. We talked about that last week, how our homes in this time of COVID have become a place of worship. And so your workplace, your home, your community are the places where you proclaim the word in the world. Archbishop Oscar Romero likewise has a beautiful statement about this. In another place, and this is something I'm exploring as I'm thinking about the word for a homily on Sunday, but he has said, the people are my prophet. Literally, la gente es mi profeta. The people is my prophet. He's looking to how the word, and Burkhart, this is good Jesuit theology. Burkhart always too is looking to the poor, for the prophetic word as well. That's where Jesus speaks. That's where Jesus speaks. But here's Romero in a homily talking to his community, and the context of this, of course, is that he was constantly being threatened of being silenced, of being shut down, and in fact, a Catholic radio station, which would broadcast his homilies every Sunday, was wiped out, was attacked more than once, 3 or 4 times it was bombed. I had the privilege actually of sitting in the studio and saying a few words in Spanish to the community when I visited El Salvador. But in any case, that's the context in which Archbishop Romero says each one of you has to be God's microphone. Each one of you has to be a messenger, a prophet. The church will always exist as long as there is someone who has been baptized. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, the church will again, the context being he was constantly in danger of being assassinated, which he ultimately was, of course. But he would keep reminding the people that if I go, you're the voice of God. You're the presence of Jesus Christ here. The church will live in you, but the church will always exist as long as there is someone who has been baptized. Where is your baptism? You are baptized in your professions, in the fields of workers, in the market. Wherever there is someone who has been baptized, that is where the church is. There is a prophet there. Let us not hide the talent that God gave us on the day of our baptism, and let us truly live the beauty and responsibility of being a prophetic people. Again, context means everything. In the case of Archbishop Romero, this empowering, helping people to know their dignity and find their voice as children of God. That's why he was killed, is because the people, once they learned their dignity, and once they knew that they had rights, once that they knew that they were not half a person but a whole person. This was very threatening, of course, to the ruling class. And so that's why Archbishop Romero and his ministry were undermined at every turn by the powerful, in the manner of Jesus Christ. Some of that rings true, of course, in what we're dealing with today. In preaching a word that gives people their dignity, their voice, their place. Again, how does he say it? Here, wherever there was someone who has been baptized, that is where the church is. There is a prophet there. So, what's going to be the source of that prophetic word that we're called to speak in this time? It's a question we're not going to answer in this little reflection. But again, the question is St. Paul's question. What do you want me to do, Lord? What do you want me to say? How do I live out my prophetic role in the community? I want to close with the words that have been attributed to Father Pedro Arrupe, another great Jesuit. who gives us kind of the basis for what it is that guides our vocation, guides our mission, guides our lives as disciples of Jesus Christ. I've used it before, you might be familiar with it. But it calls for this fundamental conversion to Jesus Christ that inspires what we say and do. Nothing is more practical than finding God, that is falling in love in a quite absolute, final way. What you are in love with, what seizes your imagination, will affect everything. It will decide what will get you out of bed in the morning, what you will do with your evenings, how you will spend your weekends, what you read, who you know, what breaks your heart, and what amazes you with joy and gratitude. Fall in love, stay in love, and it will decide everything. It was true of the prophets, true of John the Baptist, and obviously true for us. Thanks for tuning in today. God bless you.